so we can end promptly on time and honor your time. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first meeting of our final year as the BEP Review Committee. And as I said, it's 1 p.m. and I do call this meeting to order. And I do want to provide a special welcome to Senator Lundberg, who is joining us as a new member of the BEP Review Committee for the first time. And I also want to thank him for his service as chairman of the Senate Education Committee. Now, to officially begin, I'm going to call on Nathan to call the roll to establish a quorum.
Yes, ma'am. Michelle Simcox.
Here.
Chairman Mark White. David Connor.
Here.
Senator Lundberg. Is here. Ben Torres.
Here.
Eddie Pruitt.
Here.
Chris Henson.
Here.
Sarah Morrison.
Here.
Rita Hammock.
Here.
Commissioner Schwinn.
Mary Andersky for Commissioner Schwinn.
Great. Commissioner Bryson.
Dory Hicks here for Commissioner Bryson.
Great. Thanks for joining us, Dory. Cliff Lippard.
Here.
Marlon Davis.
Here.
Bob Eby.
Here.
Nikki Hall. Comptroller Mumpower.
Wesson for Comptroller Mumpower.
Robin Fairclough.
Here.
Dale Lynch is here. Larry McDonald.
Here.
Jessica Himes, or the House or Senate Budget Office. And Kurt Dronberger.
Here.
Madam Chair, you are here and you definitely have a quorum.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nathan. And thank you all for being here today. I do want to turn it back over to Nathan to read the statement of necessity.
Pursuant to Tennessee Code Annotated, Section 844-108B3, Tennessee Basic Education Program Review Committee, by and through the State Board of Education, hereby submits this letter as its determination of necessity for its committee meeting held via teleconference at 1 p.m. Central Daylight Time on the 22nd of June, 2022. This committee is charged with meeting 4 times annually to discharge its statutory duty. Because members of the review committee reside across the state, it was determined that a physical quorum of the members could not be assembled in Nashville for the purposes of this meeting. As such, the committee met via teleconference to begin its work in 2022. And this statement of necessity was read at said meeting. That, Madam Chair, you are in legal.
Thank you again, Nathan. The next item on the agenda is the TISA TISA overview. And we have Charlie Bufalino here with us from the department to take us through the overview. So I am going to turn it over to you, Charlie. And I think we'll have question and answers along the way, unless you would prefer that we hold questions till the end. What is your preference?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm perfectly comfortable taking questions as we go, as we navigate through this. So first of all, thank you for having us at the department. We're very excited to give you a little bit of an overview of the Tennessee Investment in Student Achievement Act. This was a really huge deal getting this passed this last session. We're incredibly grateful to the leadership of Governor Lee and our partners at the General Assembly for their bold and historic action on behalf of our students. There's a lot of work for us to do in the next 18 months as we get ready to roll this out for the 2023-24 school year. And as we'll get into sort of later in this presentation, we're in the early stages of a rulemaking promulgation process as well to further flesh out this historic piece of legislation. So with that, I will dive in. And as I said earlier, feel free to pop in if you have questions as we go through this presentation. And I'm trying to navigate the slide deck here. There we go. Okay, this first slide, just the department's sort of strategic plan of academic student readiness and educators. This informs everything that we do over at the department and certainly is woven into every piece of TISA as well. So,
excuse me, Charlie.
Yes,
If
Chairman.
you could turn your video off, you're actually, well, maybe I can pull you down. Never mind. Go ahead. Thanks.
Okay. So the structure of the presentation is I'm actually going to kind of take us through just an overview of the different sections of the bill to provide an overview of sort of what's in there and share some additional information as we go. And like I said earlier, want to certainly save plenty of time for questions as well. So the first part of the TISA legislation really is about talking about what the goals it is supposed to accomplish. And these goals probably shouldn't come as a surprise to most of you that have been paying attention to the vision we've been setting here as part of the Lee administration for what our overarching goals are. We want to make sure we empower each student to read proficiently by the end of third grade. We want to prepare each high school graduate to succeed in the post-secondary program or career of their choice. And we want to provide students with the resources they need to succeed regardless of their individual circumstances. This was sort of the preamble or the beginning section of the bill, and this is of critical importance and is woven sort of throughout the piece of legislation. I want to talk a little bit about the TISA guide. This will start for the first time next year, but every July 1st, the department will create and publish a very comprehensive guidebook outlining the procedures for administering TISA. There are some minimum requirements laid out in the law, including identifying data that we've got to receive from each district in order to administer the funding formula, explain how that data is sort of submitted, how LEAs can dispute any kind of a reporting sort of error or something of that nature, and also state that the comptroller can't approve a local government budget that fails to include the local contribution amount. That's something that sort of functions currently as well, and identifies whether LEAs qualify as sparse or small districts, as well as other sort of eligibility criteria like fast growth and things of that nature that we'll touch on here in a little bit. The guide really will be much more comprehensive than just those minimum requirements. The intention really here is to provide, especially for our school districts, but really for all stakeholders, a comprehensive overview of everything that goes into this funding formula, schedules for when funds are distributed, highlights sort of from past years, recommendations that we're getting from districts as well for perhaps future changes, things of that nature. So we anticipate this being a very important and comprehensive resource going forward. This next sort of slide kind of gives an overlay of how this student-based funding formula works. In a way that's quite different from the BEP, which was a resource-based funding formula that was based very much on ratios and system-wide averages. TISA is a student-based funding formula, and so funding is determined at the individual student level. And what this slide kind of weighs out, and I know many of you have probably seen this slide before, is what the four different kind of levels of the funding are within TISA. So first, we have a base amount. That's the funding that every single student in the state receives, regardless of where they live. That's $6,860 per student. And then on top of that, and we'll get into some more detail here in a few more slides, there are weights based on individual student characteristics and needs, things like students who are low income, students who live in sparse districts, students who have special needs. And there are percentages of weights on top of that base that factor into the funding that individual child generates. From there is direct funding. So for some of our specific initiatives, things that we have taken on as a state, like for example, students who are in grades K through 3 for purposes of early literacy, there's some additional funding that comes through in that direct funding category there. And then finally, TISA also includes some student outcome incentives funding that provides some additional funding really over and on top of the formula for districts that are able to meet certain metrics in terms of individual student achievement. And we'll cover some more of those specifics here in a minute. This next slide is really to show, I think, how much simpler TISA is in terms of being able to calculate what your overall funding looks like at a district level. So in terms of, and these are some actual projections, although we don't have a specific district labeled here, of real numbers and how that you can sort of figure out what the total funding you're going to get is, rather than the 47 components of the BEP and a lot of those subcategories. It's a pretty simple, and this is sort of a single page that kind of gets you there. And it's really about some horizontal multiplication and then some vertical addition, and then you can get to what your totals are. So just to quickly kind of walk through this, you start out by multiplying that base funding for the total amount of eligible students. and then you apply the weights that you see here in this next section. So, there's a weight as part of the law of 25% for economically disadvantaged students. So you would take the total amount of your students who qualify for that and multiply that by the 0.25 or 1.25 and figure out sort of what that additional total is. Concentrated poverty is weighted at 5% for students who attend eligible Title I schools. Students who are in small districts, so those are our county systems with 1,000 or fewer students. Students who are in sparse districts, so if you are in a district where there are less than 25 students per square mile, that generates an additional 5% of funding too. The unique learning need codes, those are the existing special education codes, as well as things like characteristics of dyslexia, which have been added in, as well as our English as a second language additional funding. And that is a component that, is further getting spelled out in the rule promulgation process now in terms of some of that specificity. And then you see the direct funding below that. There's a direct funding allocation of $500 additional for every student who's in grades K through 3. That was something that was added on fairly early on in the process by our steering committee of legislative leadership, really just wanting to show additional weight and support for some of those early literacy efforts that we have taken on in earnest over the course of the last several years. There is a direct funding for 4th grade tutoring because the 3rd grade reading retention component of the Learning Loss Remediation and Student Acceleration Act of 2021 requires students to be provided options for either summer school or tutoring, making sure that we're continuing to sort of fully fund both of those options. So you see that in there as well. There's direct funding for CTE, which much like the ULNs is getting further spelled out in rule currently. And then the ACT component you see there, the state has funded the ACT as well as an ACT retake, and this is just making sure we're pulling that funding through and continuing to do so through TISA. In a somewhat similar way, there has existed a public charter school grant facilities fund since 2017. We're pulling that grant funding into the formula to further consolidate and simplify where all the funding is coming from, and so that moves into direct funding as well. And then finally, there's a list here of some of what the other outcomes funding, fast growth. I'll talk about those, I think, in another slide or two. But the point here of this slide is this is what a district would see. We've been able to share with some superintendents our sort of TISA calculator and have had them sort of play around with this live and some of their numbers and be able to sort of see a predictable kind of budgeting tool that is much simpler to sort of go through than sort of what we've currently had. I see a question in the chat. I'll try to answer now really quick. Eligible students for the base. So pre-K is not part of the TISA funding formula. The voluntary pre-K program will continue to be funded separately and is not part of the TISA funding formula. There was a little bit of talk about that very early on in the process, but ultimately that didn't come through as part of this. And then adult learners is also sort of something that's funded separately and has not been part of the K through 12 funding formula. We're talking about extraneous grants. That's a great question. There are a lot of grants that currently have existed outside of funding formula that have been moved in. And Robin, you're noting a few of those examples right here. Family Resource Centers is one of them. Coordinated school health, school safety grants. Many of those things have been rolled into the base, and there's a nice kind of one-page explainer of many of the components that go into the base. Now, the base is an amount that districts get to decide how they want to allocate those funds, because just because the base has contemplated or folded in funding sort of for those programs, TISA really maintains that kind of local district autonomy and flexibility of how they want to choose to go allocate those. We'll talk about the expenditure reporting stuff a little bit later on and kind of show how those two things marry up. But this remains a very autonomous funding formula in the sense that these funds sort of get generated, but there are not ratios, there's not prescriptions that come down from the state. Really, the only exception to that, it has to do with teacher salary increases, in which if the legislature in a given year designates a certain amount of funding in the Appropriations Act for teacher salary increases, those must go to current educators, and there's some parameters in the law for that. Other than that, districts get to choose how they allocate those funds, and we're just going to ask and require really under the law very explicit, transparent reporting on the back end so every relevant stakeholder knows where funds are going under this. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a little bit. Kind of sort of already talked about this, but just to highlight a few things that are kind of further getting spelled out in rule now. Unique learning needs, like I mentioned, special education, English learners, characteristics of dyslexia, the CTE direct funding amounts. You may have heard throughout testimony that the idea here is to weight higher high wage, high demand areas sort of for certain areas. So that's something that's going to have to get revisited somewhat regularly sort of through the rulemaking process as local economies change and needs of those economies change. And we want to make sure we match students with those high wage, high growth sort of opportunities. Salary increases, I really sort of actually talked about this a little bit in the last slide, but the one area of the funding formula that can be restricted for specific purposes is if there are annual increases for teacher salaries, which would go into the student-based funding amount, but districts would only be allowed to spend that specific amount of funds on current educators as determined by those who are currently evaluated under the state system, meaning folks who are in the classroom or working sort of directly with students in those sorts of capacities. And then this last bullet is something that's currently true of the BEP as well. Whenever there's an increase to salary schedules, the department brings a proposal to the state board for a corresponding increase in the minimum salary schedule. We actually just did that in May based on the $125 million the legislature appropriated this year and raised that minimum salary schedule to $40,000 now as a starting point statewide. The next section to talk about is the student outcome incentives. So this will be subject to appropriations on an annual basis in terms of what the total pot of this funding will look like. But as part of the law, the commissioner must convene an advisory group when choosing to set those amounts. And that is something that we actually did for the initial sort of proposals you'll see in the rules. The individuals it includes is 3 directors of schools representing urban, suburban, and rural Tennessee, at least 1 teacher, the chairs of the 3 education committees, 2 on the House side, 1 on the Senate side, the chair of the State Board of Education, parent of a student enrolled in a Tennessee public school, 1 further resident of the state, a business leader in the state, and a member of a local school board. So the idea here is that whenever these are sort of being set, that there's a group that's convened to advise the commissioner on her recommendations, and then that of course will have to go through rule in terms of that getting finalized of what those outcome incentives will be. Moving right along, fast growth stipends. So actually, sorry, I see another question in the chat. Do current class size requirements still apply? That's a great question. They do. We did not in TISA amend really any of the programmatic requirements that exist currently. So class size is a good example. The current requirements in law remained unchanged by TISA, so those are still in effect. Another example and a question we got a couple times in testimony was, because the coordinated school health funding is getting rolled into the funding formula rather than being a separate grant, do those requirements of administering the program go away? And the answer is no, because those portions were left unchanged in code. That's a good question. In terms of fast-growing stipends, this is really intended to provide some additional state support for school districts that are growing rapidly. And it's kind of broken into 2 separate parts. The first part is a fast-growing stipend for LEAs who have a current year growth above 1.25% of enrollment increase from the previous year. So TISA, like the BEP, is set up to be funded on prior year enrollment to give districts some predictability in terms of what's happening. But if you in the current year are showing 1.25% enrollment growth or higher, you will get funded for that growth based on current year numbers. And so, there's a handful of districts probably every year who that will apply to. And then this other piece, which is new, is an additional fast-growing infrastructure stipend. And so if you are growing at a level for 3 consecutive years of 2% growth year over year in that period, you're in a situation where you're certainly having to build new school buildings to accommodate that level of growth. And so this is really intended as something of an infrastructure kind of stipend Obviously, school construction and things of that nature is really primarily a local responsibility, right? And goes through local bonds and some of those measures at the local level. But if you're seeing that much growth, this is the state sort of saying there's a certain amount that the state will be able to sort of chip in to help out with that somewhat. And then if after those first two are unfinished, if there is still money left over for the amount that's appropriated annually, we will dip below that 1.25 until the money runs out, essentially. So in a given year, you could see school districts that are funded at 1.1 or 1% that are able to receive some of that fast growth stipend, just depending on what the total allocation is. Distribution of funds. So this sort of remains largely similar to it is in the BEP. Funding will be distributed throughout 10 periods throughout the school year. And there is a certain hold harmless for any districts that do not see a funding increase under TISA. There were 6 school districts total who did not see an increase under the new funding formula based on the projection sort of at the time. Obviously, it could change slightly between now and when it fully rolls out. And so essentially what this does is it says in the first year of TISA, you'll be guaranteed to get 100% of what you generated in FY23 of the BEP. And then there's a 4-year step down. So that would go to 75% of that total in the second year, 50, and then 25%. For these 6 school districts, it's really just a product of they've seen such significant student enrollment decline that even with the increase of funds and the lowering of the general lowering of local contributions, which we'll talk about in a minute, it still wasn't enough to prevent those schools from seeing a sort of loss. And the important takeaway here is those schools would have lost under the BEP also and would have lost sort of more significantly. The idea or the intent behind this is to have a step down process, but still a need sort of across the system to right size if enrollment decline is showing like that. Another sort of hold harmless provision is that if an LEA sort of have a cap of what a decrease they could see is in a single year. So let's say a plant closes in a small community and a bunch of folks kind of leave a district, that loss would be capped at a 5% decrease for the prior year, or the state would make up the difference. So if you see a 9%, the district would only experience the 5%, and the state would pick up that additional 4%. And then, as we'll talk about sort of more here in a second, distressed and at-risk counties won't need to increase maintenance of effort as a result of fiscal capacity, and states will cover the difference. And we'll talk a little bit about that local contribution here in a couple more slides. And then finally, I'll mention, and this was, I think, actually really the latest or sort of last amendment to the bill, there was included a cost differential factor in the final version of this that passed. That's something that had existed historically, but was getting phased out based on a law passed in 2016. Essentially, what cost differential factor is it's a way to calculate essentially cost of living in certain counties where that's particularly high. It's something that CBER sort of calculates. There's a handful of districts that it would apply to, but it's a dynamic thing that can sort of change on an annual basis. And so what the amendment sort of said was, it said that it will reestablish cost differential factor as a grant program outside the funding formula. And, the reason that's important is, by definition, this is a student-based funding formula. Cost differential factors are about additional system sort of costs based on higher cost of living in an area. So this, I think, was sort of the compromise by several of the members and folks who were trying to sort of weigh that out to include something for this, but to ensure that it's outside the funding formula. So a district that experienced a cost differential factor and sort of makes it on that list will get a certain amount of additional funding, but it won't raise their student base to beyond a student in another county who doesn't have that, which would defeat the purpose of a student-based funding formula. So that's kind of where that individual piece landed, but it was included in the final version of the legislation. So local contribution and fiscal capacity, been dancing around this one a little bit so far, but we'll get into it now. So first and foremost, this largely does not change from the current structure under the BEP. So the state and local share, and this is an average, right? This isn't the fiscal capacity of every individual school district. is a 70-30 state split for the base and weights only. And then the state would cover 100% of direct funding outcomes and fast growth. And a good way to think about this is, if we all go out to dinner together and then a check shows up that we've all got to pay for, someone, I guess it'll be me, I'll represent the state. I say, okay, I'm going to take 70% of this, and then everyone else has to cover that 30%. That doesn't mean that everyone pays the same amount. Someone might be a doctor, someone might be a custodian, someone might be a mechanic. Based on your ability to pay, that determines how much that you put in, right? And so that's where fiscal capacity comes in, which is a system, two systems that determine what each individual county essentially ability to pay is, and that determines what the local amount is. Maintenance of effort, which is another term that many of you are probably familiar with, states that districts cannot lower the amount that they local governments, cannot lower the amount that they've contributed in previous years, except under certain circumstances like a large enrollment drop or one-time funds they petition to use that aren't recurring in nature. And so to go back to that dinner party sort of analogy, if I get back a local contribution bill that says I owe $10, but I choose to put in 15, I have to put 15 again next year. I can't sort of lower that amount. And many of our districts, to their credit across the state, do contribute more than that local required match, and that's where that maintenance of effort piece comes in. There was a lot of talk about this kind of throughout the session of, is this just a four-year kind of hold harmless, and then there's a cliff where this is all going to catch up sort of all at once. And that's not the case. Essentially, what the state did with the initial increase in investments and making the only the base and weights apply for a local contribution is we essentially took what the local contribution was now, lowered it fairly significantly, and it will continue to increase with additional investment in a commensurate rate or process that it was under the BEP. And for most districts, it would take them on average approximately 4 years to get back where they are today. But there were several analyses that were done about this. We did ours and shared those out with school districts through 2030 in a series of projections we did throughout the spring. And there was an independent analysis done by the Sycamore Institute that went all the way out to 2035 that showed that indeed local contributions based on our current numbers and projections are considerably lower under TISA than they would have been under the BEP. And there's that report and some additional information on that is available on our website as well. The one thing that changes here that is worth noting, I think, for this group is while we remain in a split between CBER and TASER in terms of the calculation that determines fiscal capacity, the law does set forth an annual process by which that needs to be looked at or considered on a regular basis. Both evaluated by the comptroller and ultimately under the authority for the state board to decide if that should change at all. And that is new. That's not something that was part of the BEP funding formula. There was nothing that compelled either CBER or TASER or some other group to look at this on a regular basis. So I do think that's important. There was a lot of talk throughout this about some folks wanting to go to just a single model. We heard different things from different districts, from local governments too. I suspect that this will remain a topic that folks want to revisit in the coming years, and TISA sets out a mechanism or a process by which to continue to look at that. Any questions before I move on here? This might be a good spot for some. I'm trying to keep up with the chat. I don't think I see any others that I missed.
Let's see, Dale's wanting to weigh in.
Please.
You unmute me for just, do you have me unmuted, Nathan?
Yeah, you're unmuted.
Hey, Charlie, this is Dale. I apologize. I'm in the car and I do not have that the TISA rules with me that you all have sent or going to send to the state board. But there is a section in there. Would you go over it for us about school districts, multiple school districts in a county, and what you all are proposing in the rules for that as far as the fiscal capacity and how that reads? And you can mute me again, Nathan.
So let me ask a clarifying question. You're saying in the rules related to multiple districts within a county and how that plays out?
Yes. I was reading in the rules that there's something in there about the department and your all's role in looking at school districts, multiple school districts in a county, and what does it say, and what's your all's intent there?
Sorry, I was on mute too. So it's really not a change of current practice. We did sort of look into when we were at the law, there was a lot of folks who said, we need to change the system to determine it at a district level rather than a county level. We explored that and talked to some folks at SEBRA and other places. And basically what we heard back is, unless you change the tax structure that exists currently, that's not going to change something at the ground level, because that all gets determined at the county level. That was far too big of a thing, I think, for us to take on as part of a school funding formula reform. I'm not sure specifically what you're referring to as part of the current proposed rules. It's our duty, as sort of it is currently, to figure out what that is between multiple districts, of how that gets split up and multiplied by the local contribution. But there isn't some sort of big change in terms of how that's done currently. It's really left unchanged.
So that's what I was wanting to know, just if it had not been changed. Thank you.
Yes, sir. All right, I will keep going, but please jump in if you have a question. So professional development, a piece of the law talks about how the department will provide, and this is one where this kind of changed a couple times via some amendments as it went. We will provide a no-cost professional development training series on TISA and the TISA guide, some basic budgeting principles, how to link budgeting with sort of achievement goals and strategy and things like that. And we will provide this free of charge, really for anyone who wants to take it. There'll be an asynchronous version, but specifically geared towards director, state, local school board or governing board members, state board members, their executive director, the charter commission, really anyone at the state or local level that has to do with having any kind of role in either district or school level budgeting. We want to provide this sort of resource for them as we make this transition. We think this is a really critical opportunity for us to provide that level of support for our school districts. And this is something that we are working towards sort of procuring and having that be something that folks can experience over the course of the next roughly 18 months before this goes live. This is an optional professional development. There were earlier versions of the bill, particularly on the House side, that had that sort of being required for certain groups of those individuals that I mentioned. Final version of that is not the case. The requirement is on the department to provide it. It is not on anyone to take it or pass an assessment, but we will sort of have those that we can provide for folks to take advantage of. Improved reporting. Every LEA, currently we have the BEP review committee, which is made up of folks from across the state who get together multiple times a year and review how the BEP is working and making recommendations. That will continue in a form, which I'll get to in a second. But we want to make sure that we provide every single district in the state an opportunity annually to provide sort of formal feedback and recommendations on TISA. And as I mentioned earlier, we will roll those up into our annual TISA guide that the department has to put forth so that everyone sort of has an opportunity to see that sort of going forward. We'll include academic analyses of districts. We'll roll in accountability report cards that sort of go currently, and we'll include even some outside sort of experts with feedback and recommendations too, so that we can regularly look at whether there are changes that need to be made on TISA based on what we're seeing from the field. And that'll include detailed reporting on funding and spending. And the first sort of in-depth study related to that will be done by the Comptroller's Office by December 31st of 2024. And I think, one thing I'll point out here too is, we currently have a requirement under state law sort of before TISA, and it actually exists in federal law as well, to report school level per pupil expenditures. And that's something that has been really hard to do in a meaningful way under the BEP because of the way that funding formula functions. We really think under TISA and this student base and much simpler to understand way of funding, it will be much, much easier to see what those expenditures look like on the back end. And that will be something that will be important for district officials and school-based sort of officials, but also for parents and for other stakeholders to be able to see, I know my student generated this amount of funding because I can just see what their eligibility categories are and multiply it out. Did my school district, allocate those for my child in that way? Did it go to something else? How can I have some transparency and accountability into that process to drive meaningful change, I think, over time? That's something that we think is going to be a really important part of this shift to TISA and that we're excited to see over the coming years. Transparency and accountability, I was just sort of talking about this a little bit. As part of the annual budgeting process, districts will have to, and many districts do this already, will have to include their academic sort of strategic goals as part of their budgeting process and annually sort of describe, how their budget enabled them to make progress towards those goals or where it fell short and why they're providing recommendations or shift in budgeting the next year, sort of, again, trying to link academic goal setting with proactive budgeting and then looking at it on the back end in terms of what expenditures look like. And that must sort of be part of a public process and allowing for public comment locally as they go through that. And then finally, a level of accountability more at the state level. Any school district or charter school that receives a D or an F under the school accountability framework and the letter grade system that will roll out for the first time this fall may be asked by the State Board of Education to appear for a hearing to discuss their funding and outcomes. There's no requirement that the state board calls up any of those individual schools. It will be their prerogative in terms of how many or how they sort of want to go about doing that for schools that meet that barometer. And then the results of that hearing are pretty specific in the law. The state board can either ask TDOE to take no action, ask to check in later or something like that. It could require a corrective action plan in which the department would work with the district to develop a corrective action plan, which would be a template that would be public and sort of out there ahead of time, detailing sort of what those areas or things might be. This is also something that we have done in the past, perhaps with federal spending of funds. It's not a brand new concept or anything like that. Or it would require the department to do a more sort of formal audit and investigation of academic programming and spending, which again is something that TUE can sort of do currently. So, it's not a takeover thing. The state board can't do anything related to governance or has nothing to do with ASD or anything of that nature. It's sort of these specific actions that they can take if they do choose to bring any district or school in front of them for a hearing. And again, this too is another area that changed sort of somewhat frequently sort of throughout. There was an earlier version in which the legislature and an ad hoc committee would take on that responsibility, but ultimately it landed with the state board in terms of the final version of the legislation. Another piece that was somewhat of a late addition was the establishment of a literacy and progress review board. This would establish goals for student achievement related to literacy, including a goal of 70% of a district students in third grade meeting on track or mastered, essentially proficient on that third grade ELA TCAP assessment. That 70% mark would make Tennessee the leading state in the country. That's sort of the top mark right now in terms of ELA proficiency. And what this portion of the law would do is it establishes this sort of new board, which would be made up of the Commissioner of Education, the state board chair, and 2 members appointed by the Speaker and the Lieutenant Governor of the House and Senate, respectively. And all of these folks would serve on 2-year terms. And what the goals would be for districts is not that you would reach 70% in this 3-year period, but that you would close the gap by the equivalent of 15% over each of the 3-year periods. So it's based on where you're at currently, what it would take you to get to 70, and then a corresponding percentage of that depending on where a district would lie. And the board would look at this annually in terms of what progress might be. And at the end of the 3 years, the board could recommend the commissioner to require additional training for those districts. And that is the only remedy that is given under the law for this particular portion. So, and I think, and I don't want to speak for the amendment sponsor or any of the members, but I really think the idea here was kind of similar to putting additional direct funding in K through 3 for literacy, which is just This is a key goal of our state in terms of third grade reading proficiency, and continuing to draw additional attention and focus in that area, and trying to do so in a way that I think wasn't meant to be punitive, but to continue to shine a spotlight on us making as aggressive progress as we can on that metric and that goal as possible.
Charlie, this is Bob Eby. I have a question.
Yes, sir.
So closing the gap by 15%, is that 15 percentage points or is that 15% of the gap? In other words, if they're at 30 and going to 70, the gap is 40. So 15% would be 6%, or is it 15 percentage points?
I believe it's the former, and it was actually amended a couple times to make sure it sort of got that way. So it's really intended to be based on kind of where you're at.
Thank you.
And then I had a question in the chat: is that metric a district goal or an individual goal? They want. I think it calls for it to be reported for both, but it's an overall district goal in terms of what triggers the review. All right.
Really, just one quick question. When does
Please.
this board begin to meet?
I believe I might have to double check the law. It's not right away. I think it was 2024. But let me try to go back and check and make sure I have that.
That's what I thought
correct.
too, but I just thought I'd see if you had that off the top of your head. So thank you.
Yeah, I will make sure I look that up before we're done and get an answer back to you on the board itself. So some additional reporting requirements. We already talked about the first one in terms of the state board being able to call folks up for a hearing if they're a D or F on the letter grade system. And actually, this slide is almost completely redundant to one I had earlier, so sorry about that. We'll skip on to the next one. So the TISA review committee. So earlier I had spoke to the portion of the law that allows and invites each individual districts to make recommendations and provide feedback on TISA and some of the changes they'd like to see on an annual basis. But we still preserve the function of a statewide entity as well. And so the law does call for a TISA review committee to be established. It is exactly the same makeup in terms of membership and what's called for and meeting frequency, all of those things. It is exactly the same as what existed in code currently for the BEP review committee. We just changed the 3 letters to 4 letters in several spots, and that will kick off beginning in 2026. Chairman Lundberg was actually the sponsor of this amendment that sort of established it starting there and sort of preserving this component. And I think the idea was, let's give a year or two of TISA to see what's going before we know what sort of recommendations we might want to make, and seeing what districts themselves sort of propose first. But beginning January 1 of 2026, the TISA review committee will be established, and it will continue to sort of sit administratively under the state board as the current BEP review committee does.
So Charlie, one clarification.
Please.
The executive director of the state board will officially serve as a member of this new committee, but not a state board member. So I would imagine that was done by design, or do you have the rationale for a board member being excluded from the state board?
No, I think that may just be a typo. It should be exactly the same as it is currently with the board chair serving on it. So I may just have that slide wrong, but we did not change that statute.
I don't think you
at
do.
all.
I don't think you have it wrong, Charlie, because in reading the rules, I did see where it said executive director. And in all honesty, in 2026, I will not be on the board, but I'm just thinking about the representation from the board. Sarah will certainly, if she's still the executive director in the future, would certainly be an excellent representative for the board. But a member itself, I think, should be here. And it is in the rules written this way, just so you know.
So the other
Yes.
side of that is, that it is attached to us, and there's a lot of people that fit a lot of different categories. It's, I would be surprised if it was interpreted in a way that it wouldn't be within our prerogative to assign a member on there. But I'm also sure that we could get it changed legislatively if we needed to change it to the board chair.
No, that's right. And I'm looking back at it now and looking at the current code. That is the current way it reads in the current statute. And so I assume that, to what Nathan said, at some point it was decided to have a representative from the state board as part of that. So we didn't change that portion of the code when we did it, but you are right, Chair Lady Hartgrove, that is how it reads in terms of the
Okay,
executive
great.
director. Also, I
Thank
looked
you.
up the progress review board piece really quick, Chair Lady, and it's July 1, 2023, in which that group would first be called upon to be formed.
Great, thank you for that clarification.
I think one other that I've heard from folks at different points in time. So we know that in previous versions of this act, there was this process of an annual review of the fiscal capacity model on a general basis, with the comptroller weighing in and the board weighing in. But isn't it now that could happen just one time? I mean, I know there's the part in there about the district submitting the feedback and so on, but I thought that we had addressed this concept that there would have to be an annual reestablishment of what the fiscal capacity model is, for purposes of, among other things, making sure that, bonds are issued in a stable fiscal environment. And I'm just looking through the statute. I'm kind of missing if I'm wrong about that.
So your question, Nathan, is in the final version of the law, is there a charge for the state board and the comptroller to sort of annually look at this process?
No, so the fiscal capacity calculation, it says means of formula evaluated by the comptroller or the treasury and approved by the state board that determines fiscal capacity is the average of the fiscal capacity estimates generated by the formula established by Boyd Center for Business and Economic Research and TISA. But I'm remembering, or correct me if I'm wrong, I think there was an earlier version where that was going on every single year, but in the final version that it was just, it wasn't necessary for that to happen on an annual basis. And I'm looking through the statute at the moment just to see if I'm correct about that.
I think the annual part remained in the final version. I'll try to pull the specific provision for you and share it with you, but I'm fairly certain it maintained the requirement. It doesn't require that action is taken annually, but it does say that on an annual basis, the comptroller and the state board will look into that and decide if changes needed to be made. And I'll try to pull that specific provision for you.
Okay.
Just a couple more slides here, and then we'll open it up for other questions. So I just wanted to cover a little bit of an overview on where we're at with rulemaking. So there are several elements of TISA that require additional specificity to be spelled out in rule. And in many ways, a lot of what we're trying to do is there's several elements of the BEP currently that are things that are just sort of done internally by the department administratively through business rules that don't go through sort of a public process by getting established. And so in the interest of transparency, that was sort of a major goal of this shift to TISA, we wanted to make sure that we brought all of those things out into the open. And so there's a significant amount of rule promulgation that's needed. And that rule promulgation mostly, not entirely, but mostly will be done by the Department of Education directly, because these are sort of administrative functions of ours in carrying out administration of the formula, rather than them being rules that are promulgated by the state board. However, the law sets out a role that the state board will play in for any rule promulgation that takes place related to TISA, where the state board will provide a positive, neutral, or negative recommendation that will be part of the public record and get carried through the rule as it goes to review by the Government Operations Committee and ultimately gets posted on the Secretary of State's website to ensure a tight collaboration, I think, between the state board and the department as part of this process. Some specific areas that are laid out that require rulemaking that I touched on are the unique learning needs, the direct allocation funding amounts, and the outcome incentives goals. But as I said, any rule promulgation that takes place has to receive that positive, neutral, or negative recommendation from the state board. So where we're at in the current timeline is we had several sort of conversations with some folks in the field and some experts in certain areas to gather some initial input as we were thinking through sort of initial drafting of some of those rules. And then on June 6th, we released essentially a draft of proposed rules for folks to react to and submit public comment to. We have really tried to extend a very lengthy public comment and engagement process to get as much feedback and engagement as we can from various stakeholders in the general public, rather than just having, a single sort of rulemaking hearing and a few business days as is often the norm. We wanted to have a really lengthy process in terms of getting that input and feedback on the front end. So this timeline here kind of lays out what this will look like over the next few months. We have the release of those draft proposed rules on the 6th. We are accepting public comment now. All folks have to do is send an email to tisa.rules@tn.gov, and we are collecting and looking at all of that feedback we're getting as we contemplate changes to the draft of the proposed rules. On July 21st, as part of the state board's workshop ahead of their July meeting, we're going to have an initial discussion with the board members to present the draft rules in their sort of current form, to answer questions, to get feedback from the board members. But we're not voting, or the board will not be voting on their recommendations at that point in time, because we won't have finalized rules yet, and we want to go through the entire public comment period. There will be that formal public rulemaking hearing on July 28th. There'll be a physical location that's noted there, as well as the ability for virtual participation. But again, that's just the formal sort of in-person hearing. All of the public comment that we get will be looked at and analyzed in terms of changes to the proposed rules. That period closes on August 2nd, and then we will finish our process of compiling and making changes ahead of a special called state board meeting on August 11th, and it is at that meeting that the board would issue their positive, neutral, and negative recommendation on the rules. There is still some rulemaking that will be to come in the future, like, for example, things like the direct funding specific dollar amounts. The department is required to codify that in rule, but we don't get to choose those amounts. That goes through the appropriations process and is the responsibility of the governor in his proposed budget and the legislature in their approval of the budget and dispensing of that to determine what the overall funding is for that. And so we will have to come back next year and sort of finalize what those amounts are going forward. So that's largely the kind of rulemaking timeline we're looking at for this first portion of those rulemaking, and it's a lot. There's pretty significant rules, 20 odd pages of them or so, and those are posted on our website now. We're taking feedback. We are anxious to hear from y'all and your various constituents and stakeholder groups to see what sort of feedback you have as we continue this next phase of this historic piece of legislation. And with that is all I have in terms of the formal presentation, but I'm happy to answer any other questions folks may have.
Are there any member questions for Charlie?
I have a question, Charlie, if you don't mind. Marlon Davis with Wayne County. Going back to slide 6, if you will. There's a section there, direct funding. Yes, I just had a question about the direct funding piece there. There's 5,000 by CTE, and it says number of eligible students. Then it has a range, 3,500 to 6,000 based on number of eligible students. Is that based on maybe the program, CTE program, and the demand of costs for each program? Or what is that range about?
Yes, sir. It will be. And those are projections based on the current data and numbers we have. This area too ultimately will depend on what the overall appropriation is going to be for the specific CTE direct funding, but how you described it is exactly right. It will be a reflection of what costs are to run programs and further incenting what those high wage, sort of high demand industry pathways are sort of for folks. So that 5,000 you see there is really a rough average, but it will depend on individual students enrolled in individual programs in terms of what those exact amounts will be. And that will be spelled out in the rules very, very specifically.
Okay, thank you.
Chair Lady, this is Andy
Yes,
Pruitt, Gibson County. Charlie, I got a question for you. I just want to, one of the things with BEP funding, it was resource allocation. So we would, run our numbers and we would say we get X number of teachers, and then you all would adjust the salary that we would get for those teachers. And, the General Assembly would increase that amount, when they would increase funds for teachers. So the way that I'm assuming that this is going to go is that's going to totally go away. So it won't be like, the General Assembly increased teacher salaries by X% because there's an amount that's going to go into the base or wherever, how they decide to do that. I guess you could figure that out by how much was going into before and then how much of an increase that was. But are you seeing what I'm asking there?
Yeah, a couple things I'll note. So one, you'll have to be able to determine what the change is because the law requires that additional funding that does get added to the base, the way you said, which is correct, that has to go to current educators. And so that will have to get figured out and parsed out to make sure those salary increases go to current educators. And that is a change from the current BEP, which just says it has to go to the instructional component. So that could be future educators. There's a lot more sort of flexibility there. And that was something that the legislature felt pretty strongly about in terms of really targeting that for existing educators. So the other thing I'll note is the programmatic requirements, and someone had a question about this earlier about class size restrictions and things of that nature. All of those things still apply. And when we were calculating, what the base was going to be, which is actually quite a high base. It's the second highest of our peer southeastern states in terms of the total amount of what that is. We took kind of the most generous ratio in terms of class size requirements, used that as the base, and kind of walked backwards from there. So there's certainly more funding that can go to things like teacher salary under the current base than there was under the BEP. And so but your overall point, I think, is correct in the sense of there is more autonomy for districts, I think, to make those current decisions because it's less about sort of specific ratios. And then the other piece here is it's not just the base, right? Student weights very likely, I think, will be used for personnel-related supports. If you have a high amount of economically disadvantaged students, you may want to choose to have more teachers in some of those grade bands and would have the funding flexibility to do that because of those additional weights that are coming in. Or it could be paraprofessionals or tutoring that you're wanting to push in instead. So I do think it gives a lot more flexibility locally to do things like that, and perhaps more so than the BEP, which was, I think, more prescriptive in terms of what you could play around with in that sandbox because of the very specific ratios. But I think the key point is there's more funding overall in that than there was sort of before. And that's even just in the base before we even start getting into the weights with the increased, $1 billion of new recurring funding that's going through. Does that help answer your question? Great.
Other questions for Charlie?
Could I ask a question again about base as it pertains to preschool?
Yes, ma'am.
So I know that you said that preschool is not included in it, which I understand there's separate funding for voluntary pre-K. But when it comes to students with disabilities in the BEP formula, they did count under options of services. So preschool students with disabilities who were federally required to provide services for, we would get funding through BEP, not through a base, but through their option of services. Will we not get any funding for those students through this, or will we only get the added weight, but not the actual base for them?
Ms. Fairclough, I'd like to look into that a little bit more to make sure I verify that with some folks to make sure I get you accurate information. I suspect it's probably the latter as you described, but I will check on that and circle back with you if that's all right.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Other questions or comments?
Yes, Madam Chairman.
Yes.
In regard to, hang on, let you see my ugly mug here for a second. So Charlie, in the information you gave us, and you went kind of fast over the SRO portion and talked about just general safety. Can I get a better understanding of that? Because I know in Bartlett, we just added another almost $1 million to have police officers in every school, which we're taking out of the half cent that was passed to go towards education. But long term, I know the feds are putting some more money in. I was trying to understand how that would work on a state level.
Sure thing. So there have been two kind of historic pots of funding related to school safety and SROs. The one that I was referring to is the Safe Schools Grant or the school safety grants. That is a recurring pot of grant funding, which for the last couple of years, it was doubled by Governor Lee up to $20 million in 2019 and has maintained at that level for the recent years. That pot of money is being folded into the base under TISA. Same amount of money, it's not going anywhere, but it's going to be part of the base level funding. There was a separate one-time non-recurring grant specific to the hiring or the support of hiring of SROs that also came through in 2019. That was intended to be a 2-year grant that was for districts that did not have SROs in schools that wanted to hire them. That funding is running out currently, and it has not been replaced or made to sort of be recurring or anything of that nature to date. There are a lot of conversations going on about that, and I imagine it's going to be an issue that continues to get looked at. We were able, based on what the uptake looked like, to spread that grant funding past the initial 2 years, and currently districts are getting what, if there aren't further changes, what the final amounts will be for that before that grant funding is fully expended, which it will be this current school year. So 2 separate pots. The only other thing I'll note on that front is the Safe Schools grants and the school safety grants certainly can be used towards SRO related initiatives locally if they so choose to. There's nothing that limits the ability to use the funding for that.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Other questions? No more questions. Charlie, I do want to thank you so much for being here with us today. This gave everyone obviously an opportunity to ask questions and make sure that we have a better understanding of what is coming forward with the recommendations that you presented and all the hard work that went behind getting to this juncture and ultimately the General Assembly approving it. So thank you so much. So many people were involved in this process, but we know the heavy lift was in the department and with the General Assembly. And we thank you all for your due diligence in getting us to this point and having a funding formula that is now focused on students more than it ever was before. From my personal perspective, I know that there are many others who hold that same sentiment. I know that there were many critics along the way. I think we're all critics until we know and see in the final analysis how this works in reality. So thank you so much. We do appreciate your time.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and certainly the most important piece of legislation I've personally worked on, but and I appreciate the kind words about the department, but I know, Commissioner Schwinn too would say this was very much a team effort, and lots of people who are on this call right now were a key to getting this thing across the finish line. I think in particular the support and advocacy of our school directors and many advocacy partners and folks who are focused on providing our students with the resources they need to succeed. This really took the best of all of us in Tennessee, and we're just very motivated to continue to work hard on it going forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Nathan for next steps.
Okay, I've gone ahead and also posted that public chapter 966 on the side there, so everybody's able to read through it and look through it themselves. I don't think I'm necessarily speaking out of turn. We've got Senate Education Committee chair on here, and I've had conversations with Chairman White as well. It's kind of an interesting spot we find ourselves in on the BEP Review Committee at this point in time, because the statute that authorizes us and requires us to do this work goes away, but hasn't yet. And so we're in a spot where obviously our normal process of going through and making recommendations about making changes to the BEP formula is moot. There's not a real purpose in that happening. However, we are sticklers about following what the law says, and so since it's still in effect, we're going to have our meetings. The way I'm kind of looking at this and envisioning it is in conversation with the chair and many of you individual members is that we could assign dates and call the next 2 meetings, and if a quorum didn't show up, then the attempt will have been made. And because it seems to me that the next substantive piece of work we'll need to do is to approve the final report, because that statutory requirement is in place. And so rather than kind of not doing anything, we would still go through and compile the information as we normally do. And as our Mary Ann Dursky and the folks over at Local Finance do. And then we would come back to this group to authorize the publishment of the final report. That's what I'm anticipating as far as this organization and this committee goes for the rest of the year. But I'm certainly happy to take any questions or do whatever you please, Madam Chair.
Are there any questions for Nathan based on what he just said or otherwise? Very good. Thank you so much for that, Nathan. The only other agenda item is closing remarks, and I'll just ask one more time if anyone else has anything they wish to say before we conclude.
Did we approve the recording of the previous meeting and this one as the minutes thereof?
I left it out of it's. You know, Nathan and I had a conversation, and he said, Lillian, please remember to say that the recording from the previous meeting will serve as the minutes. And I did not say it after I told him I would. So I'm saying it now. Without objection, the minutes, the recording of our last meeting will serve as the minutes. Is there any objection? Without objection, so ordered. Thank you for that, Nathan. And thanks to everyone for your participation today, and once again for your service on this committee. And without objection, we are adjourned. Thank you.